The mark you see on my nail is a mark of a person who's just voted. What do Western ambassadors do in India? If my ambassadors did a fraction of that, you would all be up in arms. So I think there are double standards here. There is a reaction in many parts of the world to self-appointed custodians, people who've never fought an election, who are nothing to do with democracy, actually telling the rest of the world what is right and what is wrong in democracy. You know, democracy doesn't put food on your table. Actually, in my part of the world, it does.
One of my favorite stories about Mahatma Gandhi was when he traveled to Britain and somebody asked him, "What do you think about Western civilization?" And he said, "I think it would be a good idea."
We're still waiting.
Yeah. So let me paraphrase that slightly. As we're having this discussion, this tortured discussion, what do you think about Western democracy?
Well, look, before I do that, let me, because I think I appear to be an optimist in what is a relatively pessimistic panel, if not room. So I'll begin by sticking up my finger, and don't take it badly, it's the index finger. The mark you see on my nail is a mark of a person who's just voted. We just had an election in my state, just over. Last year, we had a national election. In Indian elections, roughly 2/3 of eligible voters vote. At the national election, electorate of about 900 million, about 700 million voted. We count the votes in a single day. Nobody disputes the result after it's announced. And if you look, and by the way, from the time we started voting in the modern era, 20% people more vote today than they did decades ago. So the first message that somehow democracy is in trouble globally, worldwide, I'm sorry, I have to differ with it. I mean, right now, we are living well, we are voting well, we are optimistic about the direction of our democracy, and for us, democracy is actually delivered. Senator, you said that, you know, democracy doesn't put food on your table. Actually, in my part of the world, it does, because it actually, today, because we are a democratic society, we give nutrition support, food support to 800 million people, and for whom that is a matter, you know, of how healthy they are and how full their stomachs are. So the point I want to make is, look, different parts of the world are going through different conversations. Please do not assume that this is some kind of universal phenomenon. It is not. There are parts where it is working well. Maybe there are parts where it's not. And the parts which are not, I think people need to have an honest conversation about why it's not, you know. I would argue that as to an extent, as someone dispassionately viewing it, which was your question, there are some problems. A lot of it is an accumulated problem of the model of globalization that we've followed for the last 25, 30 years. I think a lot of chickens have come home to roost. Yes, there are issues, but from our perspective today, for us, democracy is delivered. We have a visibly less elitist society. We have one where the public has faith in the political process, where actually every election, in a way, has been a kind of a verdict on the quality of governance. That, I mean, I told you we just voted in one, my party won that election. We were in the opposition earlier. We had a national election, my party won that election too, and we were incumbents. And we feel, you know, if the Prime Minister Modi got elected for the third time, the ruling party got elected, and to a large extent it is because of the delivery through democratic systems. So it is healthy, it is well, maybe not all over the world, but let's not make that universal. All big countries are unique to an extent, but we would certainly hope, I mean, to the extent we think of democracy as a universal aspiration, ideally a reality, but at least an aspiration, it is in large part because India chose a democratic model after independence. And it chose a democratic model because we had fundamentally a consultative, pluralistic society. Now, there was a time, and I have to say this in all honesty, where West treated democracy as a Western characteristic and was busy encouraging non-democratic forces in the global South. It still does. I mean, in many cases, I can point to some very recent ones, where actually everything that you say you value at home, you don't practice abroad. So I do think the rest of the global South will view, the successes and the shortcomings and the responses of other countries. They will also ask themselves which ones of them they relate to, I would argue that in many ways, India, because it's historically been an open society, one very much linked with the world, many countries of the global South are more likely to say the Indian experience is more transposable to their societies than perhaps those of others. So I do think in our progress as a democracy, the fact that, for all the challenges that we've had, even at a low income, we have stayed true to the democratic model, which is almost, if you look at our part of the world, we are pretty much the only country that has done that. So I think it's something the West should look at, because if you do want democracy eventually to prevail, it's important the West also embraces successful models outside the West. I would challenge the equation of, liberalism in a kind of an international way with democracy. I do think different societies have their own cultures, their own values, their own ways of doing things. And the idea that there is some kind of one truth and one judgment and one norm, and that should be preached, propagated, evaluated, and judged. I think that is one of the big issues we are having today in politics. And it is done by think tanks, it's done by people who do ratings, it is done by newspapers. So I think there is a reaction in many parts of the world to self-appointed custodians, people who've never fought an election, who are nothing to do with democracy, actually telling the rest of the world what is right and what is wrong in democracy. And I think it is, to me, inevitable that it will be challenged. My second issue, is, look, every country has its mainstream politics. It has its outliers, okay? If I were to look, for example, at how much Europeans, Westerners, reach out to outliers in those societies. If I were to look at what do Western ambassadors do in India, if my ambassadors did a fraction of that, you would all be up in arms. So I think there are double standards here.